APIs, looking at the policies that are available in API management, looking at some of the security that's available, and talking a bit about the developer portal. So let's get started in there. So API management's got three components. We've got a gateway, and one of the new things that they've just announced just recently is the ability to now run this gateway not only in Azure, but also in a container, which means you could put this API gateway pretty much wherever you want to. We've got the Azure portal to do all of our administration. It supports all of the RBAC controls for basically who can do what. And then we have a new developer portal. They've basically created a new developer portal that allows you to do the customizations or any customizations you want. We still have the older original developer portal, but basically the new developer portal lets you either customize the one they provide or host it yourself, which is a really neat feature because you can then do pretty much anything you want to with it. And again, the self-hosted gateway allows you to have the gateway in Azure and the self-hosted gateways anywhere you want, in your network, in another cloud, wherever you'd like. And this is a new feature just GA'd in the last month. A little bit more now into the developer portal. This is where the meat is about what we want to talk about. It's exposing services. We'll look at the authentication and authorization, because one of the things I notice a lot of times with companies when they're starting to use API management is if you go look at the different APIs they have in their environment, they are built with different sets of authentication methods, different authentication schemes, all kinds of different things because they've been built over time. People have changed their mind on how they want to do things, but they've got these existing APIs. We'll look at some ways that we can do to bring those together in there. You can also get the configuration information out of the Azure portal through Git, but most of the times I recommend the PowerShell and the ARM templates. One of the features that really attracted me to API management over the time has been the policies. Basically, I can manipulate the data coming in. I can look at the data coming in. I can transform it. There's a couple of different techniques that we can use in the transform. We can do things like XSLT if you're used to that, or you can do liquid templates, or basically pretty much kind of free range in there. We can also take a API that we have that doesn't have caching, enable caching for it. We can also, if we're having a public API that people are paying for, we can also create a kind of a starter version of that gets him the ability to do a few calls. So like, I think the starter one then API management is 5 calls a minute or in like 100 calls a day. So that you could then, if they want to go to the next level, that could give them unlimited capabilities. But if they're only doing a little bit of work, they may want to do something like that. And then the other thing is reporting on who is using your API, what they're using it for, and how they're using it. And we'll talk a bit more about that and how important that is a little bit. So I've got an API. I could have it written in a number of technologies. As you see there in the little graphic, the open API. And for me, I was a little taken aback at first when I saw that. I'm used to Swagger, but that's the official name for your Swagger is your open API specifications. You also have Waddle, which is a kind of an XML representation of a RESTful API, which is kind of that's an interesting thing to do. And then WSDL. So if you do have existing SOAP services, and if we have time, we'll talk about how one of the features that I really like in API management around being able to expose your SOAP service as a REST service. Then we also can bring in logic apps. So we talked last week about logic apps. We could also look at our existing app services that are in our Azure subscription, and we can also look at our function apps. And one of the nice things that API management gives us is the ability that the APIs that we have currently may not be where we want to take them in the future state. We may want to make some changes to the way those APIs look now, because we got all this work planned. We're going to do this stuff later on, so we can actually manipulate the inbound payload, change it to look exactly like we want it, and then do that payload manipulation in a policy in API management to call our existing API. But then when we write the new API, we'll be able to substitute that in for the old API we had. We won't have to do the manipulation anymore. It'll already be in the format that we need it. And we can make that change without our API consumers having to make any changes. So they don't really have to do a lot of work. That way we can maintain that continuity across our API. It works the same, it authenticates the same, all of those kind of things. So let's go out and look at importing some APIs. So if we go here and we'll go into an instance of API management I've got up and going, and we go to our APIs, and we basically can see that that's the screen we saw before. If we basically think about that, if we do the open API spec, let's go out here and bring in just a simple sample that I did earlier with .NET Core, or actually this is .NET Framework. Oh, actually that's not the right interface for that. So let me just get the okay. So, and it's been able to read the information about that API and bring up the name that's inside of my code, but I don't have to keep that. I could change that to take off the 2, and then I need to give it a suffix of where I want to put it in the hierarchy of my APIs. So that I might go ahead and do the same thing, my API, and you'll see this is what the URL is going to be when they call it through API management. Again, we can also put a custom domain name on this. But what I've been doing with clients recently is more about around the, let's expose API management through front door and let it do our custom domains and all of that work. And then API management just run with the existing domains. A couple of reasons I choose that is that front door will provide domain names and SSL, or not the domain names, but the SSL certificates in a managed fashion. So I don't have to go out and make sure I do a renewal on my certificate, load it up. Where API management, I do have to load the certificates in for my custom domains. I just like to cut down the amount of work that I have to do if I can. So let's go ahead and we can hit create. And we'll see my API has been brought in here. It's got a couple of get operations. Now, occasionally you could get an error, and this is an example here. If you see these 2 gets, there's a get value and a get all. In the actual API, when it was first created, I just used the sample in Visual Studio. They both were gets. One of them gets a specific record, one of them gets all of the records. And when API management went to bring that in, it complained about it. So I went and changed that to get all for the one that gets all of the records. And again, this is something that you might run into depending on how you've created the Swagger.
Hey, Bill, can we ask
Yes.
a quick favor, mate? Can we get you to just zoom in a touch if that's okay?
Yep. Let's see how we can go.
Good man. Thank you.
A little bit better.
Awesome. Cheers.
Yep. Okay. So basically, we've got our different operations, and the neat thing we could do is we could add operations if we need to. So like we could add one that's caching some of these values, and that's one of the examples that's out there in API management. To start with, you'll see that there is a get and a get cached. And if we look a little bit later on, we'll look at some of the policies that are involved in that. But again, what we can do is with our settings here, we can decide if we want to put this API into a product. So we might build products around how we think people are going to use these. And what the products do is I can get a subscription key for a particular product, and that will give me access to all of the APIs in that product. If I decide not to, don't have to have a product, and I can actually go into here. You'll see over here, there's a subscription section, which we'll look at a little bit later. We can go in there and we can go in and get a subscription key for this API. We also have a test thing. We'll get into that a little bit later on, but if I hit one of those, you can see that it basically populates all of the information I need to go off and do a test. Let's go back to all of the add APIs again. What I'll do is I can go here and I can add a function app. And what it does, because it's in my subscription, it'll ask me for one of the function apps that in my subscription. This function app actually has two functions in it. It's my really clever naming, function 1 and function 2. But you don't see function 2 in this particular screen because function 2 is one that actually looks at service bus. It basically is a trigger on service bus. It only is going to publish those HTTP trigger ones. And then basically we'll see that bringing in that function now. This usually doesn't take too much time. This particular function doesn't have any swagger or anything like that. So basically it's going to, let's see, let's go create that. Again, I could have manipulated any of those settings that I wanted to at this point, but for time purposes, I think we want to try to keep as much time. And see this particular one, if we were to look at the function, it basically has both post and get in the function definition, so that I can do a post or I can do a get. Just for time's sake, what I did is I've got another API or another logic app out there, and I've actually brought that logic app into API management so that I can call off to that logic app. And one of the things is, how would you know it's a logic app? So let's go have a quick look at the testing. And we'll see I've got a sample one there. I'm going to change this number to a different number. I'm going to pick a product. Don't have to in this particular case, and you'll see it's going to post that request. And the reason we know it's a logic app is all of the headers that come back from this logic app. And one of the things we can do, I've actually used a policy, which we'll look at in a little while, to remove a couple of those headers. So one of the headers that typically comes back is the actual name of the logic app that it's running. And you may not want your consumers to see that. And we'll look at a different way to get rid of those in just a second too. So let's hop back to the slides. So are there any questions?
Yeah, we've got a great question come through from Anonymous. From companies embedded with MuleSoft, how easy is it to transition?
Just depends on how they've published the APIs in MuleSoft, because basically if they have Swagger for those APIs, it should be just a straightforward of importing those Swaggers, and you can set up your own API keys. So if you've got API keys that you can import a particular key, and you can also set the header of what the API key uses. So it's got a default value for that, but you can go in there and change the header. So if we go back here just real quick, help answer that question just a little bit, is if you go in here in the back into the design and in the settings, you'll see that we have what's the header that it uses for our subscription key. And also if we want to pass the subscription key as part of a query parameter in the thing. So depending on how you set that up, you could manipulate either one of those, and then you could create your own. And we also will talk a little bit later about some of the authentication messages. But basically, if I have a Swagger definition And what you might be able to do if you don't have a Swagger for your the service that's being consumed by MuleSoft, you may be able to export the Swagger from MuleSoft, which will point to that. And then you could basically import that Swagger file into here, make some changes like the web URL and things like that to make it point to the right place. And then you would have that API there.
That's awesome. So Anonymous, if you want some more assistance with that, please feel free to reach out to myself or Shri as well. I'll be happy to sort of help you out with that.
We've got some email addresses and everything at the end of the deck. So just to give people how to get in touch with us. So the other thing that we want to look at is policies. And what we can do is we can implement a policy for all APIs. And there is, by default, when you're using the new developer portal, it needs to put a all API policy in there to do the CORS. So it knows how to do that cross-region resourcing. So it puts one of those in there. We'll have a look at that. Then we could do it at the product level. So there is a starter product out there that has a throttling enabled on it. So if you make more than 5 calls in a minute, you get back an error. You could also do it at the API level, and you can also do it at the operation level. So individual operations can have data manipulation and caching and things like that. So you may not want to cache all of your API, but you may want to cache a particular set of operations. Our policies are also used to restrict access. So we can say we can whitelist or blacklist APIs or IPs. Sorry, IPs. You can do things about authentication. So if you have it set up to use OAuth tokens, which is a JWT token, you can actually crack the token open to validate to make sure it's a valid token. And you can also look at the claims inside of the token. If you're certain of your operations are only admin operations, you could actually open up the token, make sure that that token has that person as an administrator, and then you could block access to that particular API if they're not. We've got our caching, and then we have transformation policies. So we're going to hop back out to a demo, trying not to do too many slides. So if we go back and look at all APIs, what we'll see here is we'll see this CORS policy. And if I look at that, it's basically saying from my developer portal as the origin, allow any method, any header. It is restricted to that particular origin. But again, sometimes you need to make those a little bit different. One of the nice things we have is we've got snippets. So here are some of the policies that we have. So we've got the CORS, we've got authenticate with basic, and these authenticate with basic, client certificate, and managed identity token. That's the authentication from API management to your API. That's not an inbound authentication. That's not coming from the user of the consumer of the API. That's for API management to talk to your back end. And this is what I said before in the opening, is that no matter how you've built the API, it could be client certificates, it could be managed identity, could be basic authentication. You could put those into API management and then use the API management keys and OAuth 2 to protect those. You can also check the HTTP headers, you can restrict IPs, you can set quotas. These are some of the really interesting ones. If you happen to have an old style API out there and you're deciding that, oh, I need to be able to expose this API to a mobile phone, and I want to do a JSON payload as opposed to XML payload, I can do those conversions in API management policies. And believe it or not, before API management was available, we'd actually done some work where we put BizTalk in front of some older style SOAP services and expose them as REST to basically handle that. You can do find and replace strings in the body. You can mask the URL in the content. You can rewrite the URL. Now, why would we want to rewrite the URL? So let's go have a look at one of the examples of that. If we look here at get sources cached, what we do is this URL is resource-cached. But what happens is in the back end, it's actually just resource. So by coming into the cached endpoint, what it does is if it happens to be in the cache, so we'll check here and basically we check to see if it's in the cache. If it's not in the cache, we need to go back to the backend service and get it. So what we do is we rewrite the URL from resource-cached to resource, make the call, and then when the response comes back, we actually add that to the cache. So that is one of those things that you'll see that we're using a policy to do. While I'm here, I'll talk a little bit more about what the difference is inbound and that base. So you'll notice backend has a base and then backend. So basically, if I'm doing a policy that is at the operation level, if I put my policy information in before the base, it executes before the policies that might be in at the API, the product, or all APIs. They do have a really neat tool to help you figure that out. You see this button down here that says calculate effective policy. And basically, first thing it asks you is like the product, and I'll do starter. So you'll see that it brings in some extra policy. So it brings the Coors policy in, brings that rate limiting policy in, brings that caching policy in, and that gives you what the policy is actually going to be for this product or for this API when it's used with that product. I could change the product and you'll notice that rate limiting is gone. So that's a really neat button to be able to use, is to be able to do those. And again, what you would do if you want to add a policy to any of these, you can go in here, look at the snippets, scroll down, find the policy you want. Another one that I want to mention is mock response. Now, I don't know about your development experiences, but I get into a situation a lot of times where a customer wants to start a project and they want to start the mobile phone developers and the backend API developers the same week. And there's already a problem there because that mobile phone guys are going to want to hit those APIs as soon as they can. The developers building the APIs haven't got them ready to hit. So what we can do is, what I typically do is I handcraft the Swagger for what the API is going to look like. I import that into here, and then I set up the mock responses. And then that way it will mock back to the developers some data. The other thing that I've done is, what you can do is you can call off to another backend. And what I've done in the past is I've actually called off to an Azure function, and the Azure function has been running a mocking utility called Mockaroo, where you can say, I want a person, I want a company name or something like that, I want a street address, and it will actually bring you back reasonable data. It won't just bring you back field 1, field 2, field 3. So that's a really nice thing about being able to do that at the mocking a couple of different ways in here. Let's see, limit concurrency level 2. So basically, if I wanted to do something here, I could just open up a section, limit the current concurrency, and then how I want it to base the concurrency off of. So I can do that there. One of the other things that and then basically, if you don't use that policy, you can just do that. Let's see the snippets. There's a few other ones there that I've used. So one of the things I might want to do is down here in my output, I've got a API that I'm calling that brings back a really custom content. So what I can do is here is I can say, fix the content type, override it, and make it JSON. So that will allow me to override it. One of the things that I've done, and I'll go ahead and save that. One of the things I've done in my demo API here is that I've gone in And in the outbound processing, I've done a set header. And what I've done is I've done a delete on those two headers, so that basically the headers that are coming back from my service, I don't want them to show up in the output. So I've been able to delete those. The other thing you can do is put out information into the trace. This is just a sample value, but you'd want to pick up things out of that. One of the other ones they've got here is a log to event hub. And one of the reasons they have that log to event hub is if you want to capture the full body. The logging that's in API management will only capture a certain amount of the body. If you've got big requests coming in, you might want to capture more of that. Event hub is a very, very quick logging mechanism that'll give you the ability to do that. So that's pretty much what we want to talk about in some of the policies. Any questions? Actually, any questions on the policies?
Amanda, did you have some questions? Amanda's on mute.
Hey, sorry, wrestling with the typical can't get my headphones working problem. So Logic Apps has a signature in its URL. So how does API know that the request is coming from a valid source when we call it via API Manager?
Okay, so basically what you're talking about is if we go in here to the settings, for this, you're talking about this fairly ugly piece of there, I'm assuming. And that's basically gets brought in as the web service. If you bring in functions, functions do them a little bit differently. Functions actually create a backend service. And then I think, let's see if it's got them in here. So there is it adds to the named values, it adds the key for that function, because typically the functions have function by key, and then basically adds those to the key value pair in API management and then uses them when it's calling those APIs. So yeah, it takes care of all of those pieces around doing that. And you'll see here is it sets the backend service up here through a policy, the backend ID there. And if you were to export the ARM templates, you would see that backend service being set up. So I've done that because the importer to add a new API for function apps doesn't run in PowerShell. It only runs in the portal. So what you end up doing is bringing them into the API management instance and then exporting the ARM templates and using those ARM templates to build the backend service and the function key and things like that. I hope that answered the question, because I think it. Okay, let's go back to the slides. So the other thing that we want to talk about is around some of the centralized security on all the APIs. There's been a lot of discussion over the recent times about how much security you need for an API. Is an API key enough security? And basically you ask 10 people and you'll typically get 10 different answers about that. It depends on how sensitive the information you're doing that the API is providing is. If it is a weather API that will give you the weather forecast for your local area today, you probably don't need an API key at all. And I'll show you in API management how to turn off the API key requirement. But if it is customer data, or if it's sensitive data about a person, things like that, their email address, things like that, you probably want to have a JWT token passed in. They have to authenticate like that. And then those tokens need to be passed on all of the calls. The good thing about that is if the tokens need to be passed, they get passed to API management. API management can be set up to validate those. And then those tokens are passed on to your backend So if you're using those tokens to figure out who the caller is and all that kind of stuff, you can basically use those tokens. They get passed through to your backend API through API management. So that helps a lot there. You can also, what I typically do for my APIs that are sitting behind API management is all versions of API management except for the consumption-based version have a static IP address. So what I can do is I can go into my app service plan, my logic app, my function, and I can set that IP address of my API management instance. So that's the only place I'm accepting calls from. So that makes it a lot, that helps that security piece, because typically I could put API management inside of a VNet and then I could put my APIs there. But most people just can't justify that extra cost. The cost of putting API management is a premium edition. And basically I want to use API management, but I'm not willing to spend that kind of money on it. So I want to use the PaaS services that are out there exposed to the internet, but I can restrict the IP addresses that they respond to, things like that. And I can also do client certificates and all of those pieces. The developer portal. Now, the developer portal is one of the pieces that lets people to discover what our APIs are. And that can be controlled by a number of security methods. So let's hop out and have a quick look of this. And if I go into the identities down here, this is where I can set identities up for my developer portal. And you'll see I can use Azure AAD and the Azure AAD B2C. So those two different ones. But I can also add a number of other providers. And so if I hit the drop down list, you'll see that I've got Facebook, I've got Google, I've got a Microsoft account, I've got Twitter. So I could set those up so people could get onto my portal through any of those. Now, in most company situations, the Azure Active Directory is going to be what I use, because most of my developers should be inside of that AAD. And I can also allow other partners that are in Azure AAD in their own tenant. I can add them to my tenant as a guest, and then they can get access to the developer portal. Now, I've also got a set of users I can add. These are the ones that are added through just the normal logon and password. Those users go into a group. One of the things that I typically do, if I have APIs that I don't want everybody to see, because right now I can go out there, I can set up to where a user has to be approved when it comes in. But one of the things that by default, they get the developer group. When you add a user to your API management, they get the developer group. So 90% of the time, what I do is I create an internal developer group. And then, so basically make those APIs that I want to keep internal, I just give access to the internal developers. That way they don't automatically be available to anybody that goes on to the portal. And a lot of my customers have also created things like partner developers. So if they're sharing some of their APIs with their partners, they basically can put those out into API management. The partners will see those APIs and get credentials and stuff to use those. The other thing I can do, which is an interesting one, for the developer portal, if I have already got my external developers using some APIs or a portal or something like that, I can delegate the sign-in to my developer portal to my website. I can send them off to a URL, they log into my website, and I can send them back to the API Management developer portal. Because a lot of companies what they want to do, they want to fully integrate the developer portal into the experience they already have. So With the new developer portal, you can actually do a lot of skinning of that to make it look just like it. And then basically you could use your existing logon for that. Now for my APIs, I may want to implement OAuth 2. And here I basically go in and I fill in all the information about OAuth. It is a little bit complex the first time you look at it. But again, in the docs.microsoft.com, there's really good information there about being able to set all of these up with your either AAD or the B2C or pretty much any provider. We've used in a couple of different projects, we've used Auth0, we've used Identity Server 3. You can do all of those. You can also do OpenID Connect, which is kind of OAuth 2.2 or whatever you want to call it. It's the kind of the next version of the OAuth. It has a similar setup in here that basically you go in there, you set up everything that you need to in there. And then what you would do is you go back to your APIs and then you add, say, if we go into this one and I go into the settings, I can go into here and I can say user authorization. I can use OAuth 2. If I had no auth 2 configured, it would be in the drop down there. So the interesting thing is that you don't have to have a single OAuth 2 provider for all of your APIs. You can actually have a different OAuth 2 provider for your APIs. So if some of your APIs are using one OAuth 2 provider, other ones can do that. And when you hook those in, the developer portal, which we'll see in a minute, actually can consume those. And you can set the developer portal to prompt you for your logon and password to get a token. Because I know if you're familiar using Postman or any of those kind of things, you would have situations where you have to go off, get a token, you have to cut and paste the token into your request and send it through the test facilities. In both the Azure portal and the developer portal will take care of that for you. That's pretty much what I wanted to cover about the identity. Let's hop back to the slides. Any questions on security?
There are, sorry, apologies, one sec. They've just been published through. So there's a good question. I'll just start from the bottom. If we have a Swagger endpoint set up in a function app, when we import the function app into API-YAM, will it utilize the Swagger definition to create a new API definition?
Yes, it will. So there's two schools of thought right now on if you're doing function apps. You can either function apps, bring them into the portal with the function app tool here, or you can bring them in via the Swagger.
Beautiful.
So
there was another one that also, sorry, Shree's also publishing them live, so
yeah.
between screens.
So there's another question. So can validated JWT handle multiple issuers? I think he's talking about, I'm a bit confused about the question. Can validated JWT handle multiple issuers?
For the tokens, I'm assuming that's what they're talking about.
Yeah, I'm assuming that, yes.
Yeah, so I think it can only handle a single issuer per API. But again, each API can have a different token issuer. So, and not sure.
Yeah. So it is from Anonymous, and that person has just come back as in, I believe JWT token validation is a policy. So within this policy, can I check for multiple issuer?
Yes. So what you could do is if you don't set up the OAuth 2 inside of your API and just, you can use the policy to crack open the token and look at the token based on that information. So yeah, you could do some token validation inside of the policy without setting it up inside of the API management portal.
Cool.
Okay.
Yep. I think that's pretty much it is right now. Other questions I've already answered.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so let's have a little bit of a look at the developer portal. And so again, the developer portal is designed so that the developers either in your organization or outside of your organization can figure out how to use your APIs. Because one of the things that we know is that the easier we make something for somebody to use, the more likely they are going to use it. So we'll look at that on grouping products. We can also add documentation in there. And the big one is the code samples. And I'll show you a little bit about that in the demo. Let's go back into the here. And basically I can get to the developer portal. The new developer portal is a little bit different, and I haven't done much with it yet, but basically when you go in as administrator, it lets you do all of your customization and things like that. And then you could go into it and use it the same way. The functionality is pretty much the same as the older developer portal. And so basically this is the older style developer portal. And basically it is, you can do some manipulation to it, but again, I can go here, I can see my API. If it responds, so just give it a little bit of a second. And so there's our API. And so like if we go down here to our get cached and do a try it, I need a key for that. So basically what I need to do is I need to go here. Oh, it signed me out. So let's sign me back in. No.
Sorry, Bill, can you just zoom in a touch again, please?
Yep. Let me just figure out why it's not letting me sign in. Okay. We will do this slightly different and go back to here, and this browser's already zoomed in. Let's go to the developer portal legacy. And so that's going to bring up the same portal. I tried to do it with a different, this is logged on as me, so it's as the administrator, so it's not a problem. It was going to be able to see those. I'll go to the Echo API. So let me just go in and bring that up a little bit bigger. There we go. And so if I go to that resource cached, I can go here and hit try it. And basically it's already filled in my key and it's ready to go. So I can hit send. And we can look here and we'll see that that took 2113 milliseconds to go the first time. Now I go the second time and it took 103 milliseconds, which means it's actually being cached. And then if I go through there now, and because let's see what subscription, I'm going to use the starter subscription. And if I go hit send, you'll see this particular one doesn't, it is now returning the rate limit. See, you get a status code of 429, rate limit exceeded. Because that's a starter one, that's got a policy on it around limiting the number of calls. If I go back here and switch this to the unlimited key and start sending, you'll see that I don't get any rate limiting in there. I can do as many calls as I want. Now, one of the other things that you get in the developer portal, if you have it turned on for the particular subscription, is the trace. And actually, it's not turned on for this one. Okay, so let's trace. Let's do a send. Let's see if we can get the trace. So now here's the trace. Basically, here's what the call came in like. And here's the header values that were sent. Here's basically what it's found in API management. It's checking CORS, it's doing cache lookup, and then it's outputting. So if I go to one of the other ones, the get resourced ones, hit try it again, and pick that's good key and hit send, and look at my trace. We'll see that we have a lot more in this one because basically we're seeing it's going to a resource in Azure and basically going off and calling it, forwarding the request there, and then getting back the response and delivering that response back to the user. One of the other big things I wanted to show in the developer portal is, like, if we go here to create resource and we go look at the bottom here, we have code samples. So if I want to call this API with CURL, if I want to call it with C#, and this does work. This is a console app. I've actually cut and pasted the code directly into a console app, added my subscription key to it, and ran it. Here's Java, JavaScript, Objective-C. So this is one of the things I like, because if a web developer or a phone developer asks me, how do I call this API through Objective-C? I go, I don't know Objective-C, but I can go in here and I can find, here's how you call it, get the request back, all that kind of stuff. And I did that exact thing. We were doing a project for one customer. They were embedding some of their API calls into Zendesk, and Zendesk needed the JavaScript. So he basically went there, pulled the JavaScript out, sent it to their developers, and they were able to do it. You also got PHP, Python, and Ruby. And so basically all of those pieces are available. And so we can also look at the different products if you have the different products set up. Also, as a developer, you can register an application that you've built using these APIs, so that if they get ready to make changes to something, they can notify you. You can also log an issue. So if you tried to use the API, it failed, you don't know why it failed, you can go into here and be able to look at that. So if we go back now, let's go back to the slides real quick. That's the developer portal. Any questions on the developer portal?
None that I can see in particular. Yeah.
Okay. No. I want to go and do one little demo here that kind of wasn't included. So let me just go into here. I'm going to go add an API. Yeah, that's all right. I'm going to go add another API. And this one, I'm going to go old school a little bit on, because I'm going to go here and I'm going to do WSDL. And I'm going to go off and select a WSDL. And let me just find the place that I've got my WSDL. And okay, let me just grab this over here. Oh. I'm going to grab this. This is a WSDL that came out of BizTalk. And let's open that one up. And so basically, and then go here and hit create. And I've got to submit. And basically it's created all of my schemas and everything based on the BizTalk piece. You'll see that I've got a SOAP body. This is SOAP. So this is API management passing through a SOAP request. And then I can hit send. Okay, let's try that one more time. Okay, that's not what I wanted to do. But basically you can see it's sending an XML body. And I thought I started that virtual machine, but obviously it didn't do it. I want to do one other thing just to show you one of the features that I really like of API management. I'm going to go back to WSDL. I'm going to select that file again. Now I'm going to do REST to SOAP, or SOAP to REST. And I'm going to give this a just a different name, give it rest to SOAP, and then I'm going to create this API. So now the difference is when I go in here and look, it looks pretty much the same, but when I go in here to test, now you notice that it's got the JSON. So I'll try to send this. I don't think it's going to work any better than the other one did, but I might get lucky. No. But what I want to do is I want to show you what they've done to make that happen. So if we go in here to the design, go in here to the policies. Oh, wait a minute. Let's pick the policy here. And what we'll see is in the inbound policy, they have actually done a liquid template to basically pull the REST data into an XML document, set up a bunch of header information, and then received back the output. They check to see if it's got an error. If not, they take and map the XML data back to the REST document and send it back. So one of the things that I really like about this is that if I've got a SOAP service now, I could use this SOAP to REST to expose it as a REST service, and then I could, over time, change my back end from being SOAP to being REST, replace the back end in the settings here. So replace that and update the policies not to have to do the mapping. And then I could have my REST services doing the request as opposed to translating it to SOAP and doing the SOAP call. So it's a good way to be able to make your way in a migration from SOAP to REST. Now, one of the things I mentioned earlier, if you didn't want your APIs to have a subscription required, so if this was a public weather service, you can uncheck this box here that says subscription required, and it'll let you run it without a subscription. So that's what I wanted to show, that SOAP to REST feature, because I think that is a really good feature. So why API management? So basically, one of the things that I see is that a lot of companies, when they develop APIs, they have different endpoints for different parts of the organization. Now, what I can do is I can, like I've done for some samples I've done, I've got api.biztalkbill.com. So I got a custom domain name there, and then all of my APIs are under there. They just have a different suffix. And again, it makes it easier for my customers to use. I've got the developer portal. They can go explore what APIs they want to use, and they can basically, it makes that reuse, especially either inside of a company or across companies, it makes that reuse so much easier. And I guess one of the better questions to ask is why not? The developer edition of API management is like 60 or 70 bucks a month. It can be covered by your MSDN subscription, so you've got some spend there. If you want to go into production with it, and you don't need the developer portal, the consumption-based version of API management is free for the first 1 million calls a month. And you can't really beat that price when you're getting started. So basically it's free. The next steps, basically just go out and take some of your existing APIs, publishing them into API management. I did this for a customer recently that basically the people calling the API didn't want to pass basic authentication, and that's what their API supported. So we exposed the API in API management, set up the API key, and then filled in the backend basic auth inside of API management, and it took very little time to do. Thank you very much. And that's a little bit about me. And do we have any other questions?
That is the majority of the questions that have come through, Bill. Thank you so much for that. That was super insightful and super useful as always. I'm just going to give it one more chance. Here we go. There is one question that just came through. Anything Bill could share about best practices around cancellation of tokens? For example, API calls a back end, but front end has dropped the call, etc.?
So basically, I don't think there's a lot that can be done on that. It just depends on at what point in the flow it's dropped the connection. You could use the trace to determine that, and it would be interesting to see through the trace how that actually where it actually detects that that's happened.
Fantastic.
So.
Awesome. All right, thank you so much then, guys. We'll wrap it up a minute early, which is probably the first time. Thank you all for your time. That was amazing. Bill, you're a superstar. Thanks again for taking the time to present all of this information to us. It's been awesome. Like I said, the recordings will be available after the session is completed, so we'll send that out to everybody. And I will pop in a little questionnaire or a survey, so please fill out your feedback there. I'd love to hear more about what we're producing here and whether or not it's actually useful.
Thank you very much, everyone, for attending.
Cheers. Thanks, time. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.